Hey guys, tonight we're climbing the iron stairs of a tower that hasn't seen a warm night in living memory. Welcome back to Coldman Survival. Tonight we're going somewhere the sun barely reaches even at noon. A rock so far out in the freezing sea that ships used to disappear near it before anyone thought to put a light there at all. We're talking about lighthouse keepers. Not the postcard version with the red and white stripes and the cheerful gulls, but the real version. Frozen hands, iron catwalks slick with ice, a stove that has to fight an entire ocean just to keep one small room above freezing. Before you get too comfortable, if you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to slow atmospheric history, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what the weather's doing outside your window. Because out on the rock we're about to visit, the weather is doing something considerably worse. We're also on Spotify now, if you'd rather just close the app and listen with your eyes shut. Links in the description. And if you want more of this to drift off to, there's a membership option with hours of ad-free video waiting whenever you need it. Now, dim the lights, get under the blankets, maybe put on a fan for that low, steady hum, because that hum is about to become very familiar. It's the sound of wind against stone that never quite stops. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to keep a single flame burning through a storm, strong enough to peel roofs off houses on the mainland, miles away, where at least there were other houses to hide behind? Could you climb out onto an iron walkway coated in ice, in the dark, in gale winds, because the glass in front of the lamp needed to be clear, or ships die? Could you spend 11 weeks completely alone, watching the sea try to take the only home you have, one wave at a time? Would you keep the lamp burning if you weren't sure anyone would ever check on you again? Well, tonight you're going to find out. Because tonight, you are the keeper. You arrive at the base of the tower in late autumn, when the sea still has some patience left in it. The boat that brought you out doesn't linger. The waters around this stretch of coast are known for swallowing hulls whole, jagged black rock hidden just beneath the surface at every tide, which is, of course, the entire reason this lighthouse exists in the first place. The men who row you out keep glancing at the sky the way people glance at a dog they don't quite trust. They unload your crates of coal, your barrels of oil, your sacks of flour and salted meat meant to last you through months you can't yet imagine. And then they push off from the rock almost before you've finished thanking them. You watch the boat shrink against the gray water until it's gone. And that is the last human face you will see for a very long time. The tower behind you rises out of the rock like something that grew there rather than something built. A column of stone or riveted iron plates, narrow at the base, narrower still as it climbs, capped with a glass room that catches what little light the autumn sky has left to give. This is your post now. This pile of stone standing alone against an entire ocean. Inside, the tower feels smaller than it looked from outside, which is the trick every lighthouse plays on the men who live in them. Space is not something you have out here. The stairs spiral up through the center, narrow enough that your shoulders brush both walls if you're not careful. Cold iron treads ringing faintly under your boots. Each level holds one small room, stacked directly on top of the next, like rings in a tree. A storeroom near the bottom, thick-walled and dry, for the coal and provisions that have to survive whatever the sea throws at this rock over the coming winter. Above that, if you're lucky, a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. Above that, a bedroom holding a single narrow bunk built into the curve of the wall itself, because nothing in this tower is built for comfort, only for survival. And at the very top, past more stairs than seems reasonable for a building this size, the lamp room, ringed in glass, holding the one thing that justifies your entire existence out here, the light itself. You spend your first few days learning the tower the way you'd learn a difficult, unpredictable animal. Which stairs creak under a heavy boot? Which door seals properly, and which one lets a thread of freezing air whistle through no matter how you shut it? You learn that the whole structure groans when the wind picks up. A low, deep sound that starts somewhere in the stone foundation and works its way up through every level. And the first time you hear it in the dead of night, you're certain the tower is about to come apart around you. It isn't. It's simply the sound this place makes when it's doing its job, absorbing the force of a wind that would otherwise be doing that to you. Winter announces itself gradually, and then all at once. The days shorten until there's barely a smear of gray light before the dark returns. The temperature inside the tower's stone walls drops even when you keep the stove fed, because stone this thick holds cold the way it holds heat, stubbornly, and it takes more fuel than you'd like to admit just to keep frost from forming on the inside of the walls. You start rationing coal before you've even been asked to, doing the arithmetic in your head. So many weeks left before the next supply boat, if the supply boat can even reach you, against so many sacks of coal left in the storeroom. It's a grim kind of math, and you get very good at it very quickly, because the alternative is running cold in February, with 2 months still to go. The isolation settles into you slower than the cold does, but it settles deeper. There's no one to talk to about the weather, no one to share a joke with over supper, no one to notice if you go quiet for a day or 3. You start talking to yourself without quite meaning to, narrating small tasks out loud just to hear a voice, even your own. Break the silence. You keep a log, required of you by the Lighthouse Authority, and you fill it dutifully with wind speeds and oil consumption and ship sightings, but you also start slipping in small private observations that no inspector will ever read, just to remind yourself that a person lives here, not only a set of duties. And duties, it turns out, are the only real structure you have left. Out here, with no calendar of ordinary life to lean on, no market day, no church bells, no neighbors to mark the passing of time, the routine of the light becomes the entire shape of your existence. You wake by it, you eat around it, you sleep in broken pieces because of it. And as the first true winter storm begins gathering somewhere out past the horizon, dragging a wall of black cloud toward your rock, you understand, in a way you didn't quite believe back on the mainland, that the storm doesn't care how prepared you are. It only cares whether the light stays lit. And so, as the wind begins to rise for the first time in earnest, let's talk about exactly what that routine demands of you. Night after night, storm or no storm, for as long as you hold this post. The clock becomes your master before the storm ever does. Lighthouse keeping, more than almost any other work of this era, runs on an unforgiving schedule that doesn't bend for exhaustion, illness, or grief. The lamp must be lit at dusk, and it must not go out until dawn, and between those 2 points, you are, in one form or another, on duty. If there are 2 of you stationed at the tower, you split the night into watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, trading the lamp room back and forth in the dark, while the other tries to sleep through the noise of the wind. If you're alone, as many keepers on the smallest, most remote rocks were, there is no trading. There is only you, waking every few hours through the night by instinct or by a small alarm clock wedged beside your bunk climbing the cold spiral stairs, half asleep to check the flame, trim the wick, wind the mechanism, and climb back down to snatch what rest you can before it's time to do it again. The lamp itself demands a level of attention that would exhaust a man even without a storm to contend with. Depending on the era and the tower, your light might burn oil, kept in a reservoir that has to be checked and refilled through the night, the flow of fuel adjusted by hand to keep the flame steady and bright. A wick left untrimmed grows a cap of carbon that dims the light and clouds the glass around it with soot. So part of your nightly ritual is climbing up with a small pair of scissors or a trimming tool and shaping that wick back into something that burns clean. It sounds like a small thing, trimming a wick, but multiply it by every few hours, every single night, for months on end, and it becomes one of the great quiet labors of your life. The light that guides ships past the rocks exists because you, half asleep in the freezing dark, keep reaching up and making it exist. Behind the flame itself sits the real engineering marvel of the tower, the optical apparatus, a great ring of curved glass prisms that bend and focus the light into a beam powerful enough to be seen for many miles out to sea. This apparatus doesn't simply sit still and shine. In many towers it rotates, slowly and steadily, driven by a weighted clockwork mechanism, not unlike an enormous grandfather clock, so that the beam sweeps out across the water in a fixed pattern, a specific number of flashes per minute that sailors learn to recognize as belonging to this particular light and no other. That rotation is powered by a heavy weight that descends slowly down a shaft running the height of the tower, and it is your job to wind that weight back up to the top again and again through the night, because if it runs out, the light stops turning, and a light that doesn't turn correctly might as well not be a light at all to a captain trying to read the coastline in the dark. Between the winding, the wick trimming, the fuel checks, and the constant vigilance of simply watching the flame to make sure nothing has gone wrong, your nights fracture into small pieces of duty separated by short, uneasy stretches of sleep. You learn to sleep lightly, almost defensively, one ear always tuned to the sound of the mechanism ticking above you, because a change in that rhythm, a slowing, a stutter, is enough to snap you fully awake and send you climbing the stairs before you've even finished deciding to move. Sleep out here is never quite complete. It's borrowed in fragments, and you pay it back in exhaustion that settles into your bones by the third or fourth week and simply never fully leaves for the rest of the season. Daylight hours aren't rest either. Not really. They're maintenance. You inspect the lamp room, glass for salt residue left by the previous night's spray. You clean soot from the lamp housing. You check the oil reserves against your careful rationing calculations and adjust if a longer storm looks likely. You inspect the clockwork mechanism, oiling gears, checking for the kind of rust that saltwater air produces with alarming speed. You cook. You mend clothing worn through by the constant friction of stairs and iron railings. You write your log. And if there's any time left, which there rarely is, you try to sleep before the cycle begins again at dusk. The days blur together into something closer to a single long shift than a series of separate days, broken only by the small, deliberate rituals you invent to mark time passing at all. A particular meal on a particular evening. A specific page you allow yourself to read in the one book you brought out with you. Rationed like the coal, so it lasts the whole winter instead of being devoured in the first lonely week. These rituals matter more than they should, because out here, without them, the days would simply dissolve into one continuous freezing, half-remembered blur, and you need something, anything, to hold on to as proof that time is still moving forward and not simply circling you like water around the base of the rock. It's into this fragile, exhausting rhythm that the first real winter storm finally arrives. And it arrives, as they always seem to, at night when you are already tired, already running on borrowed sleep, and already alone. The wind reaches you first, hours before the worst of the storm does. A low moaning that builds gradually until it's no longer background noise, but a physical presence pressing against every wall of the tower. You feel the change before you consciously register it. The tower, which normally holds a certain deep stillness even in rough weather, begins to move, not dramatically, not enough to alarm you outright, but enough that you notice the floor beneath your boots isn't quite as fixed as it was that morning. Stone and iron towers, built to withstand exactly this kind of assault, are engineered to flex slightly rather than fight the wind head-on. A small gyve in the structure that lets it absorb force instead of shattering under it. But knowing that intellectually and feeling your home sway gently beneath you at 2 a.m. are two very different experiences. You climb to the lamp room to check the light, and the wind finds you the moment you step into that glass-ringed space. It doesn't matter that the glass is thick, purpose-built to withstand exactly these conditions. You can feel the temperature drop the instant you enter, cold radiating off the panes as if the glass itself has become a conductor for the storm outside. Through it, you can see almost nothing. No horizon, no stars, no distant glow from the mainland that on a clear night reassures you there's still a world out there beyond your rock. Just black, churning cloud, and, when the beam of your own light sweeps past, brief flashes of sea spray hurled so high it strikes the glass directly. Sheets of freezing water slamming against the panes with a sound like gravel thrown by a giant hand. The waves themselves have begun climbing the base of the tower now, and you can hear them even from up here, a deep, percussive boom every few seconds as each swell breaks against the rock and the tower's foundation. It's a sound you'll come to know intimately over the coming months, distinguishing in the dark between the storm's ordinary fury and something worse, a wave large enough that its impact actually shudders up through the entire structure, rattling the glass around you and sending a jolt through the iron stairs beneath your boots. The first time it happens, you grip the nearest railing and hold perfectly still, waiting for some catastrophic failure that, this time, doesn't come. The tower groans, settles, and holds. It was built for exactly this. You remind yourself of that fact more than once tonight, and you'll be reminding yourself of it many more times before winter finally loosens its grip on this rock. Sleep, on a night like this, is not really an option. Not that the mechanism would let you rest anyway. The clockwork above needs winding more frequently as the wind itself seems to add resistance to the turning apparatus, and you find yourself climbing those stairs every hour instead of every few, checking the flame, checking the glass, checking the weighted mechanism. Because on a night like this, more than any other, the one thing that cannot happen is the light going dark. Ships caught out in this exact storm, fighting to keep off the very rocks your tower exists to warn them away from, are depending on that beam sweeping steadily through the chaos, a single fixed point of order in a night that has lost all of its bearings. You understand, standing alone in that glass room with the whole ocean throwing itself against the walls around you, that you are not merely maintaining a light. You are the only thing standing between this storm and the men currently out there somewhere in it, trying to find their way home. The night stretches on in that strange, elastic way that fear and exhaustion combine to produce, minutes feeling like hours and hours disappearing without your noticing. You lose track of how many times you've climbed the stairs, how many times you've wound the weight, trimmed the wick, wiped condensation and salt spray from the inside of the glass with a cloth that's perpetually damp. What you don't lose track of, because it's impossible to, is the growing awareness that the storm is not weakening. If anything, somewhere around what you guess must be the middle of the night, though you've stopped trusting your own sense of time, it worsens, the wind rising to a pitch that makes the glass panes hum audibly, a thin, high sound layered over the deeper roar outside. And it's somewhere in that worsening, exhausted, endless stretch of darkness that you first notice something is wrong with the glass itself, a problem that no amount of wiping is going to solve, and one that's about to force you to do something considerably more dangerous than climbing a flight of stairs. The problem announces itself slowly, the way most disasters at sea do, a small thing at first that you almost dismiss. The beam of light, sweeping steadily out across the water as it has all night, begins to look faintly wrong to you, softer at the edges than it should be, less sharp, as though someone has drawn a thin veil across the glass. You lean closer to the pane nearest you and understand immediately what's happening. Ice, not frost, not the ordinary condensation you wipe away every hour, but a genuine crust of ice forming on the outside of the lantern room glass, fed by spray that freezes almost the instant it strikes the freezing panes, building layer over layer with every wave that crashes high enough to reach this level of the tower. It's thin still, barely more than a film, but you know from every account you've ever heard from keepers who came before you, exactly how fast that film becomes a genuine problem. Left alone, that ice will thicken through the rest of the night, scattering and dimming the beam until the light that's supposed to be visible for many miles out to sea becomes a dull, useless glow barely bright enough to see from the base of your own rock, and a lighthouse with a blinded beam in the middle of a storm. This violent is worse than no lighthouse at all, because ships out there are trusting a light that can no longer be trusted to guide them. There is only one solution to ice on the outside of the glass, and it is not a solution you can perform from the warm, comparatively sheltered side of the pane. You have to go outside. Around the lamp room of most towers built for exactly this kind of coast runs a narrow iron walkway, a gallery ringed by a low railing intended for maintenance and for exactly this grim necessity, clearing the glass by hand when weather turns hostile enough to demand it. Reaching it means stepping through a small door cut into the glass housing itself, a door that in calm weather is a minor inconvenience, and tonight represents the single most dangerous threshold in your entire existence. You bundle yourself as thoroughly as the cramped space allows, wrapping wool and oilskin over hands that are already stiff from cold, and you brace yourself against the door before you open it, because you know, from every warning ever passed down from keeper to keeper, exactly what the wind is capable of doing to a body that isn't ready for it. The moment you crack the door, the storm reaches in and grabs you. It isn't wind in any ordinary sense of the word. It's a wall, a physical force that shoves the door out of your grip and very nearly shoves you along with it. And only the fact that you'd braced your full weight against the frame keeps you from stumbling straight through and out onto the ice-slicked walkway faster than you'd intended. Spray hits you immediately, freezing salt water flung horizontally by wind strong enough to carry it clear across the gallery, and within seconds, your face is numb, your eyes are streaming, and the careful wrapping you'd done to protect your hands already feels inadequate against a cold this total. You force yourself out onto the walkway anyway, because behind you, through the glass, the light is still dimming, and somewhere out in that black water, A ship's lookout is squinting toward this rock, trusting a beam that's slowly failing without you. The iron beneath your boots is treacherous in a way that has nothing to do with ordinary ice on ordinary ground. This ice is fresh, still forming, slick with a film of seawater over it that never quite fully freezes solid because new spray keeps arriving to wet it again. And you move along that narrow gallery, gripping the railing with both hands, testing each step before you commit your weight to it, keenly aware that a fall here isn't a bruised knee. It's a fall from a great height onto solid rock, or worse, into water, violent enough to kill a strong swimmer in minutes, even without the fall itself doing the job first. Every few feet, you have to release one gloved, half-frozen hand from the railing to reach for the scraping tool tucked through your belt, a simple flat blade meant for exactly this task, and drag it across the glass in front of you, breaking the thin crust of ice and letting it fall away in shards that vanish instantly into the dark below. It is slow, brutal, repetitive work, made almost impossible by the wind trying constantly to peel you off the walkway entirely, by spray that refreezes on the glass again almost as fast as you can clear it, by hands that have gone from painfully cold to alarmingly numb, a numbness you know well enough to fear, because numb hands don't grip railings properly and don't feel a scraping blade slip until it's already slipped. You work your way around the curve of the gallery inch by inch, clearing pane after pane, glancing behind you every few minutes at the beam sweeping out across the water to check whether your work is actually restoring its strength. And slowly, gradually, it is. The light sharpens again, cutting cleaner through the storm, and that alone is enough to keep you moving despite hands you can no longer fully feel and a wind that seems, if anything, to be building rather than easing. By the time you've cleared every pane you can reach, you genuinely don't know how much time has passed. It could be 20 minutes. It could be well over an hour. Time, out on that walkway, with the storm doing everything in its power to remove you from the tower entirely, stopped meaning very much. What you do know, with a certainty that outweighs the pain in your hands and the ice crusted along your eyebrows, is that the beam behind you is strong and clean again, sweeping its steady pattern out across water that's trying its absolute hardest to swallow every ship unlucky enough to be caught in this storm tonight. You retreat back through that small door with the wind fighting you the entire way, wrestle it shut behind you, and collapse for just a moment against the inside wall of the lamp room, breathing hard, hands throbbing painfully as feeling starts, agonizingly, to return to them. There will be no real rest tonight, not with the storm still raging and the mechanism still needing winding and the ice already beginning, faintly, to reform on the glass you just spent the better part of an hour clearing. But for this moment, standing inside the relative shelter of the lamp room with your light restored and shining strong across a sea that wants nothing more than to swallow it, you allow yourself something close to satisfaction. Out there, somewhere beyond what you can see, a ship's captain has just caught sight of your beam again, sharp and clear against the black horizon, and altered course just enough to keep his hull off the rocks that gave this stretch of coast its fearsome reputation. He will never know your name. He will never know it was your numb, freezing hands that kept that light burning strong enough for him to see. But the light kept turning, and that, out here, is the only thanks a keeper is ever really given, or ever really needs. Dawn arrives grudgingly, the way it always seems to after a night like the one you've just survived. Not so much a sunrise as a slow, reluctant lightening of the black to a heavy, bruised gray. You're still in the lamp room when it happens, having never quite made it back down to your bunk, and you watch through glass still rimed with a thin new crust of ice as the storm, finally, begins to loosen its grip, The wind hasn't stopped. Not by any measure a sailor would call calm, but it's dropped from the screaming, door-tearing violence of the night into something merely fierce, something you can stand against without bracing your whole body. The waves are still climbing the rock below, still striking the tower's foundation with that same deep, resonant boom, but the intervals between them have lengthened just slightly, enough that you can finally hear something other than the storm. Your own breathing, the mechanism ticking steadily above your head, the small, mundane sounds of a tower that has, once again, held. You extinguish the lamp as the gray light strengthens into something that could plausibly be called morning, following the ritual that marks the end of every single night out here, regardless of what that night contained. The flame goes out, the great lens goes still, and you're left standing in a room that suddenly feels strange in its silence after so many hours of fighting to keep that light alive. There's no ceremony to it, no one to acknowledge what you just did out on that ice-slicked walkway in the dark. You simply extinguish the lamp the way you do every morning, log the time in your book with hands that are still faintly stiff and aching from the cold, and begin, because there is no other option, the long climb back down to see what the night has cost you. The damage assessment becomes its own kind of ritual, one you'll repeat after every storm this winter, walking the tower level by level, checking for water intrusion, for anything the wind might have torn loose, for cracks in mortar or seals around windows that let the cold creep in a little further than it did the day before. This morning, you find a shutter torn half off its hinges on the seaward side, banging uselessly against the stone with each gust, and you add it to the mental list of repairs that will need doing today, on top of everything else, on almost no sleep. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes with total exhaustion, though, a stripped-down focus where you simply move from task to task without the energy to feel much of anything about them. You'll feel the weight of last night later, probably tonight, when your body finally forces you to stop, and the accumulated fear and cold and effort catches up all at once. For now, there's a shutter to secure, and a logbook to complete, and coal to check, and, underneath all of it, a bone-deep tiredness you've learned not to argue with, only to work around. You eat standing up, because sitting down for too long feels dangerously close to falling asleep where you sit, a thin porridge cooked on the small stove that's finally starting to warm the kitchen back to something resembling tolerable after a night when every door in the tower seemed determined to let the cold in. The silence of the tower in the aftermath of a storm has its own particular texture, different from the silence of an ordinary calm evening. It feels earned, somehow, a stillness you fought for rather than one that was simply given to you. You sit with your bowl and your tea and, for a few minutes, allow yourself to simply exist without a task attached to it, watching gray light strengthen slowly over water that, hours ago, was trying its absolute best to kill every ship within reach of this coast. It's in these quiet aftermath hours that your mind tends to wander toward the mainland, toward whatever life waits for you there between postings, toward the people who exist somewhere beyond this rock and this tower, and this endless rotation of storms. Letters are a lifeline out here, though an unreliable one, dependent entirely on whether the supply boat can actually reach you through weather like last night's. You keep a small stack of them in a tin box beside your bunk, read and reread until the creases have gone soft. And this morning, in the particular fragile calm that follows survival, you allow yourself to take them out and read through a few again. Not because there's anything new in them, but because the familiar words feel like a tether to something warm and human in a world that spent all of last night trying to remind you how thoroughly alone you actually are. The logbook waits for you at the small desk in your quarters, and filling it out becomes its own quiet meditation on everything the night contained. Wind speed, estimated. Barometric pressure, recorded faithfully from the small instrument mounted on the wall. Any ship sighted? None. Not in weather like that, though you know they were out there somewhere, fighting their own versions of last night. You note the ice on the lantern glass and the time spent clearing it. A dry, factual sentence that does absolutely nothing to convey what that hour on the walkway actually felt like. The wind trying to peel you off the tower, the numbness creeping through your hands, the strange, focused calm that settled over you. Once you understood there was simply no option but to finish the job. The official record will never capture any of that. It exists to note that the light stayed lit, and by that measure alone, last night was a success, however much it cost you personally to make it one. As the day wears on, and exhaustion finally starts to catch up with you despite your best efforts to outrun it, you force yourself through the remaining chores anyway, because the tower doesn't care how tired you are, and neither, really, does the coming night. You repair the shutter as best you can with the tools and materials on hand, wedging it back onto its hinges with a determination that owes more to stubbornness than skill. You check the coal stores again, running the same grim arithmetic you've been running since the season began, and note with a small, cold twist in your stomach that last night's extended lamp operation and the extra hours spent heating the tower against the storm's chill have eaten into your reserves faster than you'd like. There's still a long winter ahead, and you're already learning that the storms don't ration themselves according to your supply calculations. They come when they come, and you simply have to be ready every single time, regardless of how depleted the reserves, or you, might already be. By the time the light fails again in the early afternoon, the days this far into winter offering barely any real daylight at all, you're operating on the kind of exhaustion that makes your vision swim slightly at the edges if you move too quickly. But the lamp has to be lit again regardless, the wick trimmed, the mechanism checked, the entire cycle beginning once more as though last night never happened at all. This, more than anything else, is the true shape of a keeper's winter. Not a single dramatic storm survived and then rewarded with rest, but storm after storm after storm, each one demanding everything you have, with barely enough recovery time between them to remember what it felt like to not be exhausted. You climb the stairs again as dusk settles, light the lamp against the gathering dark, and stand for a moment in the glass room watching the beam sweep out across water that, mercifully, tonight looks calmer than it did 24 hours ago. It won't stay that way. You already know that. But for tonight, at least, you allow yourself the small, quiet relief of an ordinary watch. Unremarkable, uneventful. Exactly the kind of night a keeper learns to be grateful for, precisely because it's so rare. It's in these calmer stretches between storms, though, that a different kind of danger begins creeping in, one that doesn't announce itself with howling wind or crashing waves, but settles in slowly, quietly, in the vast empty hours of silence that stretch out ahead of you with nothing to fill them but your own thoughts, and the ticking of a mechanism that, tonight at least, is behaving itself perfectly well. The silence, you're discovering, is its own kind of weather system, one with a force all its own. In the immediate aftermath of a storm, exhaustion does most of the work of keeping your mind quiet. too tired to wander far from the simple mechanics of survival. But as the days without incident begin to accumulate, one calm watch bleeding into another, you find yourself with an uncomfortable surplus of time to think, and thinking, out here, is not always the comfort it might be on the mainland. There's no one to interrupt a spiraling thought with a joke or a question about supper. There's no market chatter, no church bell marking the hour, no neighbor's dog barking at something in the yard. Just you, the tower, the sea, and whatever your own mind decides to dwell on in the long stretches between necessary tasks. You start noticing small things about your own behavior that would probably alarm you if there were anyone around to witness them. You narrate your chores out loud, a running commentary to no one, simply for the comfort of hearing a human voice. Even your own, break the silence for a moment. You find yourself talking to the lamp itself sometimes, addressing it almost like a companion rather than a piece of equipment, a habit you'd never admit to anyone back on the mainland, but that feels, out here, entirely reasonable. Keepers before you, you've heard, in whispered accounts passed down at supply depots and training postings, have gone considerably further than talking to their equipment. Isolation, this total, sustained for months at a stretch, has been known to unravel men in ways that have nothing to do with cold or hunger, and everything to do with the simple, corrosive effect of a mind left alone with itself for too long. You resist it the way you resist everything else out here, through routine, through ritual, through the deliberate structuring of days that would otherwise dissolve into a single, undifferentiated stretch of gray. You allot yourself a set amount of reading each evening from the single book you brought with you, rationed as carefully as the coal, because you learned in your first solitary posting that devouring your only reading material in the first restless week left you with nothing but blank hours for the remaining months. You write in your personal notebook, separate from the official log, small observations that no inspector will ever see, the shape of the light on the water at a particular hour, a memory of a specific meal from home, anything that reminds you there's still a person living inside this routine, and not merely a set of duties being performed by rote. The letters help when they come, though the supply boat's schedule is entirely at the mercy of weather that has shown, repeatedly, exactly how little mercy it's inclined to offer. You've already had one expected delivery pushed back by storms, and you try not to dwell too heavily on what happens if the next one is delayed as well, watching your coal reserves and food stores with an increasingly wary eye. For now, though, you have what you have, and the small comforts available to you. A warm meal, a page of a familiar book, the sight of your own. Handwriting recording another day survived become disproportionately precious against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the sea outside your window. It's a strange kind of wealth, measured not in coin, but in these small, deliberate anchors against the silence. And you find yourself guarding them as carefully as you guard the coal and oil that keep you alive. Because the truth, settling into you more fully with each passing week, is that the isolation and the storms are not really two separate hardships to survive. They're the same hardship wearing different faces, both testing the same thing in you. Whether you can hold steady, whether you can keep the light burning and your own mind intact, when there's no one out here to notice if you don't, and no one coming to help if either one fails. And as the calm stretch of days finally begins to falter, with a change in the wind that you've learned to read the way sailors read the sky, you sense that your next real test, on both fronts, is not very far away at all. The wind that arrives that evening carries a different quality than the ones you've grown used to over these first weeks on the rock, and you notice it before you can quite articulate why. It's colder, for one thing, a dry, biting cold that feels different from the damp chill the sea usually sends ahead of a storm, and it comes from a direction that makes the older keeper's notes in the tower's logbook, the ones left by whoever held this post before you, read like a warning rather than mere weather observation. You'd found those old logs your first week here, tucked into a drawer beneath charts and spare wick trimmings, and you've taken to reading a page or two some evenings, partly for company, partly because the handwriting of a stranger describing this exact tower in a winter years before yours feels like a strange kind of companionship. That keeper wrote, in a hand grown increasingly cramped as that particular winter wore on, about a wind from precisely this direction, and what it brought with it. You close the log now and go to check the supply boat's expected arrival against the calendar pinned beside your bunk. And the arithmetic you do in your head is not comforting. The boat was due 2 days ago. It hasn't come. You've learned, in your short time on this posting, not to panic at a single missed delivery. Weather delays boats out here more often than not, and the men who row those supplies out to you are not going to risk their own lives crossing open water in conditions like the ones that have been building along this coast all week. But 2 days becomes 3, and 3 becomes the better part of a week, and the coal you'd been rationing on the assumption of a timely resupply now has to be rationed against an unknown, potentially much longer stretch, and the food alongside it. You go through your stores that evening with the lamp turned low to save oil, counting sacks and tins with the grim, careful attention of someone doing math they very much don't want the answer to. What you find is not catastrophe, not yet, but it is tight enough to demand real discipline. There's flour enough for bread, if you're careful with it, salted meat that will stretch if portioned properly, dried peas, and a modest store of tea that you decide, on the spot, to ration more strictly than you have been. The coal is the more pressing concern. A stove that's been running hot enough to keep the tower's stone walls from sweating frost has been eating through your reserves faster than the calculations you made back in autumn accounted for. Calculations that, you now realize with the particular clarity of hindsight, assumed a milder winter and a more reliable supply schedule than the one you've actually been given. You bank the fire lower that night, accepting a colder room in exchange for a longer reserve, and you climb into your bunk, wearing every layer you own, breath fogging faintly in air that's noticeably sharper than it was even a week ago. The days that follow settle into a harder, leaner version of the routine you'd already built. You cut your own meals smaller before you cut anything from the lamp's supply, an instinct that feels less like sacrifice and more like simple, obvious logic. The light matters more than you do, out here, in the strict calculus of the job, and you find yourself protecting its oil reserves with something close to reverence, even as your own stomach tightens, with a hunger you're managing rather than solving. You catch yourself thinking, more than once, about the meals you took for granted on the mainland. Simple things, a proper cut of meat, bread that wasn't carefully measured against an uncertain number of remaining days. And you push the thoughts aside because dwelling on them accomplishes nothing except making the discipline harder to maintain. There's a particular kind of cold that comes with hunger, you're discovering. one that has nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with a body running on less fuel than it needs to keep itself properly warm. You notice it most sharply on watch, standing in the lamp room through the coldest hours of the night, a deep, persistent chill that no amount of wool seems able to fully push back. You keep moving as much as the small space allows, less for warmth than for the simple discipline of not letting your body settle into the kind of stillness that, out here you've heard, can tip too easily into something more dangerous. The old keeper's log mentions this too. In an entry you find yourself rereading more than once, a brief, matter-of-fact note about the particular danger of stillness in deep cold, the way a tired, hungry body can convince itself that simply sitting down for a moment, out of the wind, feels like relief. Right up until that moment becomes considerably longer than intended. You don't sit down. You keep the rounds, you keep the log, you keep the lamp burning through nights that feel colder and longer than any you've endured so far this winter. And you watch the horizon each morning with an attention that has less to do with ships now and more to do with the simple hope of a boat, any boat, cutting through the gray toward your rock with a hold full of coal and flour, and the particular relief of knowing you won't have to keep stretching an ever-thinning supply for very much longer. That hope goes unanswered for longer than you'd like. The storms along this stretch of coast, apparently determined to keep every vessel in harbor rather than risk the crossing. And you settle eventually into something more sustainable than hope. Acceptance. This is simply the shape of the winter now, and you will manage it. The same way you managed the ice on the glass. The same way you'll manage whatever comes next, because managing it is the only option available to you out here. And you've already proven, to yourself, if no one else, that you're capable of it. It's on one of these lean, careful, hungry nights, standing your watch with the lamp turning steadily overhead and your stomach a quiet, ignorable ache beneath layers of wool, that you first see the lights out on the water that don't belong there. They appear low against the horizon, faint at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of exhausted eyes or a reflection of your own beam bouncing strangely off distant cloud. But they persist, and as you watch, tracking them with the particular sharpened attention that comes from months of scanning this exact stretch of water for exactly this kind of anomaly, you understand what you're looking at. A ship well off the course any sensible captain would choose given the conditions, and moving in a way that speaks less of deliberate navigation and more of a vessel fighting simply to stay afloat, its lights swinging and dipping with a violence that has nothing to do with normal passage through rough water. Your training kicks in before your fear has time to fully register, the drilled, repeated procedures every keeper learns for exactly this circumstance. You confirm the sighting isn't some trick of weather or fatigue, watching a full minute longer than feels bearable to be certain, and then you move, checking your own light's beam pattern to be sure it's cutting cleanly through the dark. Because if that ship is genuinely in distress, your steady, reliable light might be the only fixed point that Captain has left to navigate by. There's little else you can actually do from this rock, no boat of your own capable of surviving conditions like these, no way to reach that vessel directly, and the helplessness of that fact sits heavy in your chest as you watch those distant, swinging lights continue their erratic path across water that's doing everything in its power to swallow them. What you can do, and what you do without hesitation, is make certain your own light gives that ship every possible chance. You climb out to check the glass for ice despite the punishing cold, despite a body already running on thin reserves, because a dimmed beam tonight could be the difference between that captain finding his bearings and losing them entirely. You watch, through the long stretch of hours that follow, as the ship's lights struggle against the swells disappear briefly behind a wave large enough to hide them completely, and reappear, each disappearance tightening something in your chest until the reappearance loosens it again. There is nothing dramatic you can do beyond this vigilance, no daring rescue, no heroic gesture beyond the simple, exhausting act of making absolutely certain your light does its job as perfectly as it possibly can for as long as that ship remains in view. Toward the deepest part of the night, the lights alter course, slowly, deliberately, bending away from the rocks your tower exists to warn against and out toward open, safer water, and you allow yourself, finally, something like relief. You'll never know that ship's name, never learn whether the captain aboard her later spoke of the light on this particular rock that helped guide him clear of disaster, never receive so much as a word of acknowledgement that your freezing hours on watch, your careful ice clearing, your rationed but unwavering vigilance made any difference at all. That anonymity is simply the nature of the work. You did your job, the light did its job, and somewhere out there tonight, a crew that might otherwise be fighting for their lives against rocks hidden beneath black water is instead sailing on toward a harbor they'll reach by morning, entirely unaware of the exhausted, hungry keeper who spent the whole night making sure they got the chance. You log the sighting with the same dry, factual language you use for everything else. A ship observed in apparent difficulty, course altered toward open water, no further incident, and then you extinguish the lamp as dawn finally breaks over a sea that looks, this morning, almost apologetic in its stillness. The supply boat still hasn't come. Your stores are still thin. But something in you feels steadier than it did yesterday. A reminder, delivered by that anonymous ship's slow turn away from danger, of exactly why this exhausting, isolated, half-starved vigil matters at all. The cold deepens further as the days without resupply stretch past a week, and it's around this point that you begin to understand, in a way no amount of training back on the mainland could have taught you, just how thoroughly winter on this rock intends to test not only your discipline, but your body itself. Frost begins forming on the inside of your bedroom wall despite the stove's best efforts, a fine, silvery crust that you wipe away each morning only to find returned by evening. Your hands, chapped and cracked from repeated exposure to salt spray and freezing metal railings, take longer each day to regain feeling after your rounds outside, and you find yourself flexing your fingers deliberately, almost anxiously, checking for the numbness that would signal something more serious than simple discomfort. You develop a cough partway through the second week without supplies, the kind that starts as an irritation and settles, gradually, into something that rattles slightly in your chest on the coldest nights. There's no physician out here, obviously, no one to consult beyond your own limited knowledge and the practical wisdom passed down through keepers before you, whose old logs you find yourself consulting again, this time for a different kind of guidance. You treat what you can treat. Warm broth when your rationed supplies allow it. Rest when your duties allow it, which is to say rarely, and you push forward regardless, because the lamp has no patience for a keeper's illness. It needs tending whether you feel well enough to tend it or not, and so you climb the stairs each night regardless of the ache settling into your chest, trim the wick with hands that shake slightly from cold and fatigue combined, and stand your watch because there is, quite simply, no one else to stand it for you. It's a strange, solitary kind of endurance, nursing yourself through illness with no one to notice if you're managing it well or managing it badly, no one to bring you broth or insist you rest, only your own stubborn will and the unforgiving demands of a duty that doesn't pause for something as inconvenient as a keeper's failing health. You ration your energy as carefully as you ration your coal now, doing only what's essential, sleeping in every spare fragment of time you can claim, and trusting, because you have no other choice, that your body will hold out long enough for the supply boat to finally break through whatever weather has been keeping it away, and for this particular trial, at least, to finally ease. Relief, when it finally comes, arrives without fanfare, simply a break in the weather that holds long enough for a boat to make the crossing, appearing on the horizon on an ordinary gray morning, almost 12 days after it was originally due. You watch it approach with an intensity that surprises you, a small vessel fighting its way across still choppy water, and by the time it reaches the rock and the crew begins passing up crates of coal and sacks of flour, and, more valuable than either in this particular moment, news from the mainland and letters that have been waiting to reach you, you feel something in your chest loosen that's been held tight for nearly 2 weeks. You thank the men more than the moment probably requires, and if they notice how thin you've gotten, how rough your cough sounds, how your hands shake slightly as you help haul supplies up the rock's narrow path, they're kind enough not to comment on it directly, only working a little faster, perhaps, than they might have otherwise. That night, with the stove burning properly again for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, with a proper meal in your stomach and coal enough to keep the tower genuinely warm rather than merely survivable, you stand your watch with a lightness you'd nearly forgotten was possible out here. The lamp turns steadily above you, the sea beyond the glass calmer than it's been in weeks, and for this one night at least, the rock feels less like a battlefield and more like simply your home, precarious and remote as it is. You know, of course, that this reprieve is temporary. Winter still has months left to run, and there will be more storms, more thin stretches between supply boats, more nights that test you in ways you haven't yet imagined. But tonight, warm and fed and breathing a little easier, you allow yourself to simply be grateful and to sleep when your watch finally ends, more deeply and completely than you have in longer than you'd realized. The worst storm of the winter, when it finally arrives, gives you almost no warning at all. You've grown accustomed, by this point in the season, to a certain rhythm of warning signs, a particular quality to the wind hours before real trouble begins, a drop in the barometric pressure your small instrument reliably registers, a shift in the color of the sky towards something you've learned to distrust. This one skips most of that preamble. The pressure drops so sharply and so fast that you check the instrument twice, certain you've misread it, and by the time you've confirmed the reading is accurate, the wind outside has already begun climbing toward a pitch you recognize, with a cold drop in your stomach, as considerably worse than anything you've faced so far this season. You move through your preparations with the practiced efficiency of a keeper who's now weathered enough storms to know exactly what needs doing and in what order, securing loose items, checking the shutters you repaired weeks ago, making certain your emergency stores of oil and coal are positioned where you can reach them quickly if the main supply becomes difficult to access. But even with every preparation complete, nothing quite braces you for the sheer force of what arrives once full dark falls. The tower doesn't simply groan under this wind. It seems to genuinely strain, every joint and seam in the structure protesting audibly against pressure, unlike anything you've felt since arriving on this rock. Waves that have merely struck the tower's base on previous storms now seem to reach higher, spray slamming against the lamp-room glass with a force that makes you flinch instinctively each time, half expecting the panes to give way entirely, despite knowing, intellectually, that they're built to withstand exactly this. Somewhere in the deepest, most violent hours of that night, a wave larger than any you've experienced strikes the tower with an impact that doesn't just shudder up through the structure, It genuinely staggers you, throwing you against the curved wall of the lamp room, hard enough to leave a bruise you'll find later and barely remember acquiring. For one suspended, terrifying moment, the entire tower seems to lean just slightly, just enough that your stomach drops with the certainty that this, finally, might be the storm this rock and this tower can't withstand. And then it settles back, groaning, protesting, but intact, and you realize you've been holding your breath for what feels like a very long time. You force yourself to move, to check the lamp, to check the mechanism, because standing frozen in fear accomplishes nothing except letting the light falter while you wait to see if the tower survives the next wave. It does, and the one after that. And though you won't fully believe it until morning proves it true in the daylight, the tower, battered and shaken but fundamentally sound, holds through the very worst that this winter, or perhaps any winter this coast has seen in years, has to throw against it. Morning arrives gray and exhausted, much like you are yourself, and the assessment you make walking the tower level by level in the wake of that night reveals damage more significant than anything you've dealt with so far. A section of railing on the gallery torn away entirely. Water intrusion in the lower storeroom that soaks several sacks of coal beyond usefulness. Cracks in the mortar around one of the lower windows that will need proper repair when the supply boat can bring materials and, ideally, help. But the tower stands. The light burned through the entire night without failing. And you, bruised and hollowed out with exhaustion, but fundamentally intact yourself, understand. Standing in the wreckage of the storm's aftermath with the sea outside finally beginning to calm, that you've just survived the single hardest test this posting has thrown at you, and come through it. Whatever the rest of this winter still has waiting, you find yourself thinking, with a tired but genuine confidence you didn't quite have a few months ago. You'll survive that too. It's perhaps 2 weeks after that worst storm, in the slow, grinding aftermath of repair and recovery, that you first notice something shifting in the quality of the light itself, a change so subtle you almost dismiss it as wishful thinking, born of sheer exhaustion with winter's relentless demands. But morning after morning, you find yourself confirming it. The dawn is arriving fractionally earlier. The gray of the sky, when the clouds allow you to see it at all, carries the faintest suggestion of a different color underneath. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something less purely, punishingly bleak than the deep midwinter sky you've grown so accustomed to. You mention it in your private notebook almost tentatively, as though speaking the possibility aloud. Even to a page no one else will read, might jinx it, might invite the winter to double down out of spite. But the days keep confirming what you'd hoped you were only imagining. Winter, slowly, grudgingly, is beginning to loosen its grip. It doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen without setbacks. There are still storms ahead. You know that, with the certainty of someone who's now lived through enough of this coast's temper to know it doesn't surrender easily. But there's a shift in the texture of your days that goes beyond simple daylight hours. A lightening you can feel even on the still difficult mornings. A sense that the worst of what this particular winter had to offer might genuinely be behind you rather than still lying in wait. You find yourself, on the calmer evenings, standing on the gallery a little longer than strictly necessary, not clearing ice, simply watching the last color drain from a sky that's beginning, almost imperceptibly, to hold on to its light a few minutes longer each week. You think, on these quieter evenings, about everything this winter has already asked of you, the ice-slicked catwalk and the numb, aching hands, the lean, rationed weeks without resupply, the cough you nursed alone with no one to check on you, the storm that staggered the tower itself and left you genuinely uncertain, for one suspended moment, whether the structure would hold. You think about the ship whose lights you watched swing and struggle against the swells before finally turning safely toward open water. A small, anonymous victory that you'll carry with you long after this posting ends, whether anyone else ever knows about it or not. You think, too, about the strange, hard-won steadiness you've built in yourself over these months, a capacity for endurance you genuinely didn't know you possessed until this rock and this tower and this relentless winter demanded you find it. There is still a long stretch of season left to navigate, still storms gathering somewhere out past the horizon that haven't yet announced themselves, still cold nights and lean stretches and the ever-present demands of a light that needs tending regardless of how tired or how ready for spring you might privately be. But standing on that gallery in the lengthening evening light, watching the sea settle into a calm that feels, for the first time in months, less like a brief reprieve and more like the genuine beginning of a turn, you allow yourself, finally, a small, quiet certainty. You have survived the deepest, hardest part of this winter. Whatever remains, you'll meet it the same way you met everything that came before, with cold hands and careful rationing and a stubborn refusal to let the light go out. Because that, in the end, is what a keeper does, storm after storm, season after season, for as long as this rock and this tower and this coast demand it of you. It's a sound that wakes you first, not the wind, not a wave against the tower, but something wrong in the rhythm you've grown so accustomed to that its absence registers before you've even consciously identified what's missing. The mechanism above your head, the steady, patient ticking of the clockwork that turns the great lens through its slow, endless rotation, has changed its voice. You lie in your bunk for a disoriented moment, still half caught in sleep, trying to place what's different, and then it hits you with the particular cold clarity that comes from months of listening to this exact sound every single night. It's slowing, not stopping, not yet, but dragging, the ticks spaced further apart than they should be, like a heartbeat losing its rhythm. You're up and climbing before you've fully processed what you're climbing toward. Boots hitting cold iron stairs 2 at a time, the tower still dark around you because dawn hasn't yet broken and the lamp is still very much needed. By the time you reach the lamp room, you can see it plainly, the great lens turning with a visible hitch in its motion, pausing fractionally at points in its rotation where it should be sweeping smoothly, and you understand, with a sinking certainty, that something in the weighted mechanism driving that rotation has gone wrong. The weight that should be descending steadily down its shaft, pulling the gears in their patient, reliable rhythm, has snagged somewhere, or the gears themselves have begun to bind, worn or frozen, or simply exhausted by months of near constant operation in conditions no mechanism was ever designed to endure indefinitely. You force yourself to think clearly, despite the spike of alarm that wants to override every rational thought in your head. A lens that stops rotating or rotates unevenly stops being a lighthouse in any meaningful sense. The specific pattern of flashes this light produces, the particular rhythm sailors along this coast have learned to recognize as belonging to this exact rock and no other, depends entirely on that steady, reliable rotation. A hitch, a stutter, a lens that pauses too long in one position and rushes through another, could mean the difference between a captain correctly identifying this light and steering clear of the rocks it warns against, or misreading the pattern entirely and steering toward disaster instead of away from it. You examine what you can reach of the mechanism, tracing the shaft down as far as the small access panel allows. checking for the obvious problems first. A snagged weight. A section of chain caught on something it shouldn't be caught on. You find nothing immediately obvious, which is in some ways worse than finding an easy fix, because it suggests the problem lies somewhere deeper in the gearing itself, somewhere you don't have the tools or the training to properly access, let alone repair, alone in the dark, with a storm building somewhere out past the horizon that you can already feel gathering in the particular pressure behind your ears. There's a manual mechanism for exactly this kind of failure. A crank fitted to the apparatus for situations when the clockwork can't be trusted to do its job unassisted. And you find yourself grateful in this moment for whoever designed this system with enough foresight to build in a backup for its own inevitable failures. But manual operation means exactly what it sounds like. It means you, standing at that crank, turning the lens yourself, by hand, at the correct steady pace, for as long as the mechanism remains unreliable, which could be hours, could be the rest of the night, could be considerably longer if the underlying problem turns out to be something you can't fix at all with the tools and parts available to you out here. You settle in at the crank as the sky outside continues its slow transition from black to the deep charcoal that precedes true dawn, and you begin turning, matching the rhythm as closely as you can to the pattern this light is meant to produce, counting under your breath to keep the rotation steady, because an uneven manual rotation would undo the entire purpose of taking over from the mechanism in the first place. It's harder than it sounds, this steady, repetitive labor, demanding a level of sustained physical effort and unwavering attention that you hadn't fully appreciated until you were the one providing it directly, rather than relying on weighted gears to provide it for you. Your arms begin to ache within the first hour. Your shoulders, unused to this specific sustained motion, protest louder with every passing turn. You keep going anyway, because the alternative, a light that flashes wrong or not at all, is simply not a possibility you're willing to entertain. Dawn breaks fully while you're still at the crank, gray light spilling across water that looks deceptively calm this morning, and you extinguish the lamp at the appropriate hour with arms that feel like they belong to someone else entirely, heavy and trembling faintly from the sustained effort. But the light held its pattern through the night. That, in the end, is the only measure that matters, and you allow yourself a brief, exhausted satisfaction before turning your attention to the more pressing problem of what, exactly, you're going to do about a mechanism that clearly needs repair. You're not entirely certain you're qualified to provide. You spend the daylight hours that follow in a careful, methodical examination of the clockwork apparatus, working from memory, from the training you received before this posting began, and from a slim maintenance manual you find tucked in with the tower's other official papers, its pages softened and slightly foxed from the damp that seeps into everything out here eventually. The problem, once you finally trace it fully, turns out to be a section of gearing that's worn beyond what simple oiling can address. Teeth on one of the smaller gears rounded just enough by months of use that they're beginning to slip, rather than properly engage with their neighboring gear. It's not a catastrophic failure, not yet, but it's clearly the kind of wear that will only worsen with continued use, and you don't have a spare gear of the correct size among your supplies. Only the general tools and materials meant for minor repairs, not a full mechanical rebuild. What you do have is ingenuity born of necessity and a fair amount of stubbornness, and you spend a good portion of that day experimenting with small adjustments, a slight repositioning of the gear that changes exactly where the worn teeth make contact, additional oiling in specific spots to reduce friction at the point of greatest wear, small mechanical compromises that won't fully solve the underlying problem but might. If you're careful and a little lucky, keep the mechanism functioning reliably enough to get you through until the next supply boat can bring proper replacement parts. or until an inspector's visit brings someone with the training to perform a repair you genuinely can't manage alone out here. Your adjustments seem to help, the mechanism turning that evening with less of the pronounced hitch that woke you the night before, though you don't fully trust it. Not yet. And you find yourself checking on it far more frequently than usual through the following nights, climbing to the lamp room every hour or so just to listen, to confirm the rhythm is holding steady, ready to return to that manual crank at a moment's notice if the gearing begins to slip again. It becomes its own new layer of vigilance layered on top of everything else you're already managing. One more thing to hold in your mind through the long watches, one more potential failure point you can't fully control, but have to remain constantly alert to regardless. The mechanism holds, mostly, through the following week, with only occasional minor hitches that you address with quick manual corrections rather than full manual operation, but the underlying knowledge that it's compromised, that it could fail more seriously at any time, without warning, in the middle of exactly the kind of storm when a failure would matter most, settles into you as a new, low-grade tension that never quite fully lifts. You write a careful, detailed account of the problem in your official log, along with your improvised repairs, knowing that when the next supply boat or inspection finally comes, this will need proper attention from someone with tools and expertise you simply don't have access to out here on this rock, alone, doing your best with what little you've got. It's an uncomfortable kind of knowledge to carry, understanding that the very apparatus your entire purpose out here depends on is running compromised, patched together with careful adjustments and hopeful oiling, rather than the genuine repair it actually needs. But it's also, you find yourself reflecting during one of the calmer nights that follow. A fairly accurate summary of this entire posting distilled down into a single mechanical problem. Out here, on this rock, in this tower, you are almost never working with fully reliable tools or fully adequate resources. You are, instead, constantly assessing what's available, making the best adjustments you can manage with what you actually have, and trusting that careful vigilance and stubborn effort can compensate, at least partially, for everything you lack. It's not a comfortable way to live, but it is, you're discovering, a genuinely sustainable one, provided you never let your guard down entirely, provided you keep listening for that particular wrongness in the rhythm, ready to respond the moment it appears. The storm that arrives roughly 10 days after you first noticed the mechanism's failing rhythm catches you in a state of heightened alertness that turns out to be entirely justified because this storm, when it finally breaks over your rock in full force, tests both your compromised gearing and your own exhausted reserves in ways that feel, by this point in the winter, almost cruelly precise, as though the sea itself has identified exactly where you're weakest and decided to press directly against that specific point. The wind builds through the afternoon with a steadiness that gives you ample warning, at least time enough to secure everything that needs securing, to bank extra coal near the stove for a long, cold night, to check the mechanism one final time before full dark falls and confirm, with a tightness in your chest, that it's already showing the beginning of that familiar hitch. Worse tonight than it's been since your initial repair. You understand. Watching that lens turn with its uneven rhythm as the wind outside begins its low, building moan, exactly what kind of night this is going to be. Not simply a storm to weather, but a storm to weather while also, very possibly, manually operating a mechanism that's already showing signs of failing under ordinary conditions, let alone the additional strain a violent storm might place on gearing already compromised. You're right to expect the worst. somewhere around midnight, with the wind screaming past the tower at a pitch that rattles the glass in its frames and waves striking the base of the rock with a violence that sends tremors up through the entire structure. The mechanism's hitch worsens into something closer to a genuine stall, the lens catching and holding for several agonizing seconds before lurching forward again. A rhythm so broken that you know, without needing to think it through, that it's no longer producing anything close to the reliable pattern. Ships along this coast depend on to identify this light. You move to the crank without hesitation, disengaging the compromised gearing as best you can, and taking over the rotation entirely by hand, and you settle in for what you already suspect is going to be one of the longest, hardest nights of this entire posting. Manual rotation during an ordinary calm night is demanding enough. Manual rotation during a storm, violent enough to shake the tower's foundation, performed by a body already running on cumulative exhaustion from months of broken sleep and rationed food, and the particular toll that sustained fear takes on a person even when that fear never quite tips into panic, is something else entirely. Your arms burn within the first 20 minutes. Your shoulders lock into a tight, protesting ache that you push through because there's genuinely no alternative, because the storm outside shows no sign of easing, and the ships that might be out there fighting through it need this light's pattern to remain steady, regardless of how tired the man turning that crank happens to be. You count under your breath to keep the rhythm even, the same counting ritual you developed during your first manual operation, though tonight it takes considerably more concentration to maintain than it did before, your mind fraying slightly at the edges with fatigue, thoughts drifting toward the mainland, toward warm rooms and unbroken sleep, before you drag your focus back to the count, back to the crank, back to the singular, exhausting task in front of you. The tower groans and shudders around you through all of this, waves striking with a force that makes you flinch at the loudest impacts, even as your hands keep turning, keep counting, keep maintaining the one steady thing in a night that feels, in every other respect, entirely out of control. Somewhere in the deepest hours, exhaustion nearly wins. You feel your rhythm falter, your count losing its place, your hands slowing almost imperceptibly before you catch yourself. Force your body back into the correct pace with a jolt of something close to panic at how close you came to letting the pattern slip. You understand, in that moment, with total clarity despite your exhaustion, exactly what's at stake in a single missed beat, a single moment of the light flashing wrong, and the understanding is enough to burn through the fog of fatigue for just long enough to carry you through to the point where, mercifully, the wind finally begins to ease. The worst of the storm passing on toward whatever unlucky stretch of coast waits beyond your rock. You don't stop cranking until well past the point when the wind has genuinely calmed, unwilling to trust the storm's retreat until you're entirely certain it's real. And by the time you finally do release the crank and let your aching arms fall to your sides, gray dawn light is already beginning to seep through the glass around you. You've been turning that mechanism, by your own rough count, for nearly 6 hours straight, and your body announces the cost of that effort immediately and comprehensively. Arms trembling, shoulders locked in a deep, protesting ache, hands cramped so thoroughly around the crank's handle that it takes real deliberate effort to unclench them. But the light held its pattern. Through the very worst of a storm that tested both the tower's structure and your own compromised equipment simultaneously, the light held because you held, turning that crank by hand through hour after grinding hour rather than let the pattern fail even once. It's a different kind of victory than the ones you've grown used to claiming this winter, less dramatic than clearing ice from a lantern room walkway, less clearly heroic than watching a distressed ship alter course toward safety. But it's a victory all the same, quiet and exhausting, and entirely unwitnessed by anyone who will ever know what it cost you. And you sit for a long moment in the aftermath, arms trembling, before you force yourself to begin the day's work regardless, because the tower, as always, doesn't particularly care how tired you are. It's 2 days after that grueling night at the crank, with your arms still faintly sore, and your assessment of the mechanism confirming what you'd already suspected, that the gearing needs a repair beyond what you can manage alone, that a different kind of test arrives, one that has nothing to do with storms or mechanisms and everything to do with the simple, treacherous physical reality of living and working on an ice-covered rock in the depths of winter. You're making your way along the lower gallery in the gray, early afternoon, checking the exterior of the tower for any damage the recent storm might have left unaddressed, when your boot finds a patch of ice you hadn't accounted for, hidden beneath a thin dusting of fresh snow that arrived overnight and settled deceptively evenly across a surface that's anything but even underneath. Your foot goes out from under you with a suddenness that leaves no time for anything except instinct, and you go down hard, your shoulder catching the iron railing on your way, a sharp, immediate pain flaring through your arm that you know, even before you've fully processed what's happened, is going to be a serious problem out here, alone, with no one to help you assess whether anything's actually broken. You lie still for a moment on the ice-crusted iron, cataloging the pain with the kind of forced, clinical detachment that fear tends to produce, testing whether you can move your fingers, whether you can rotate your shoulder even slightly, without the pain sharpening into something that suggests a genuine fracture rather than a bad bruise. The relief when your fingers respond and the shoulder, while clearly wrenched and already beginning to swell, allows at least limited movement, is significant enough that you feel it as a physical loosening in your chest. But the relief doesn't erase the underlying problem, that you're injured, alone, on a remote rock with no physician for many miles and weeks still to go before your posting ends. You get yourself back inside through sheer stubbornness, favoring the injured shoulder as you climb the stairs back up to your quarters, and you spend that evening doing what limited first aid you can manage for yourself, binding the shoulder as best you're able with what materials you have on hand, working out with your uninjured arm a rough sling that will at least keep the joint stable while it heals. It's clumsy, imperfect work, performed one-handed with gritted teeth, and you're keenly aware the entire time of exactly how much more difficult everything else about this posting is about to become, with one arm significantly compromised, the stairs, the crank, the ice clearing, all of it demanding two functional arms that you, for the foreseeable future, simply don't have. The lamp still needs tending regardless, and you climb to the lamp room that evening moving carefully, deliberately, working around the injury with an economy of motion you wouldn't have thought yourself capable of before this posting forced you to develop it. You manage, though it's slower, more painful work than usual, trimming the wick and checking the mechanism with your uninjured hand doing the bulk of the labor, while the injured arm stays carefully tucked against your body. And you understand, standing there in the lamp room with your shoulder throbbing in time with your own pulse, that you've just added yet another layer of difficulty to an already demanding posting, one you'll simply have to manage the same way you've managed everything else out here, through careful adaptation and stubborn refusal to let any single obstacle become the thing that finally breaks you. The days that follow test a different kind of endurance than the storms have, a slower, grinding kind that has less to do with dramatic crisis and more to do with the simple accumulated difficulty of performing every single task one-handed, or nearly so, while a shoulder that needs proper rest instead gets asked, again and again, to do at least some of its normal work regardless. You develop new methods for old tasks, learning to brace tools against your body rather than gripping them fully with both hands, learning which chores can wait for your uninjured arm alone to manage, and which genuinely require both, however carefully and painfully you have to use the injured one. It's humbling work, this forced adaptation, a reminder that even the careful competence you've built over months on this posting can be undermined in an instant by something as simple and stupid as a patch of ice hidden under fresh snow. But the shoulder does slowly begin to heal, the swelling receding gradually over the following week, the range of motion returning bit by bit, even as a deep, persistent ache remains your near constant companion. You find yourself grateful, in a way you might not have anticipated before this posting began, for the sheer repetitive rhythm of the workout here, because the tower doesn't allow you to simply retreat into recovery, doesn't grant you the luxury of rest until you're fully healed. It demands, instead, that you continue functioning through the injury, adapting around it, and that demand, uncomfortable as it is in the moment, forces a kind of steady, incremental healing that pure rest might not have provided nearly as effectively. Your body relearning its full range of motion through necessity rather than through any deliberate program of recovery you'd have chosen for yourself given the choice. By the time the shoulder has healed enough that you barely notice it anymore, except in the coldest, dampest hours of the night, you find yourself taking stock of everything this winter has already demanded of you, and the accounting is considerably longer than you'd have predicted back when you first arrived on this rock in the gentler days of late autumn. A compromised mechanism you've patched together with careful adjustments and vigilant monitoring rather than a genuine repair. A shoulder injury nursed alone through nothing but stubbornness and forced adaptation. Nights of manual operation that left your arms trembling with an exhaustion unlike anything you'd experienced before this posting began. And through all of it, the light has held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but reliably enough, night after night, that every ship passing this stretch of treacherous coast through the entire worst of this winter has had exactly the guidance it needed to steer safely clear of the rocks below your tower. There's a particular satisfaction in that accounting, quiet and hard-won, that you find yourself returning to on the calmer evenings that follow, standing watch with a shoulder that aches faintly, but functions, tending a mechanism that still needs your vigilant attention, but hasn't failed you catastrophically. Existing still as the sole reliable presence on a rock that has tested you more thoroughly than you'd have believed possible before you actually lived through it. Whatever remains of this winter, and you know, with the particular clarity that comes from months of hard experience, that there's still real winter left to endure. You find yourself facing it now with something that feels less like simple survival and more like genuine, hard-earned competence. The accumulated knowledge of a keeper who has met every single test this rock has thrown at him, and so far found a way through every one of them. The change, when it finally becomes undeniable rather than merely hoped for, arrives not as a single dramatic morning, but as an accumulation of small, unmistakable signs that you find yourself collecting almost obsessively, the way a starving man might count coins. The ice that's rimmed the lower rocks around your tower for months, thick and treacherous and utterly permanent seeming through the deepest weeks of winter, begins retreating at the tide line, exposing dark, wet stone that hasn't seen open air in what feels like a lifetime. The wind, when it blows, still carries a genuine bite, but it's lost that particular knife-edge quality it held through the worst months, the kind of cold that used to find its way through every gap in your clothing within minutes now taking noticeably longer to properly settle in. You notice birds again, gulls and other seabirds that vanished from this stretch of coast sometime in deep winter, wheeling back around the rock in numbers that feel, after months of their absence, almost startling. You allow yourself, cautiously, to believe it. Spring, or at least its earliest, most tentative advance guard, is genuinely coming. And with it, though you try not to fix your hopes too firmly on the date, the eventual end of this posting, the eventual boat that will carry you back to the mainland, and whatever ordinary life waits for you there after months of a life that's been anything but ordinary. But you've learned enough through this long, hard winter not to mistake early signs for actual arrival, and the coast doesn't disappoint your caution. There's one final serious storm still waiting in the wings, arriving on a night when you genuinely begun to let your guard down slightly, convinced by nearly 2 weeks of gentler weather that the season's real teeth had finally been drawn. It hasn't. The wind that builds that evening carries real force behind it, not the sustained weeks-long siege of midwinter's worst nights, but a sharp, concentrated violence that reminds you, in case you'd started to forget, exactly what this coast is still capable of, even as the calendar insists spring is technically underway. You move through your preparations with the practiced efficiency this winter has drilled into you, checking the mechanism which has held steady since your repair, if not fully restored to reliable, banking the stove, securing everything that needs securing, and you climb to the lamp room as full dark falls, with a calm you genuinely didn't possess back in autumn, when a storm of this size would have left you gripping the railing in barely controlled fear. The storm does its worst through the deepest hours of the night, waves striking the tower's base with real force, wind screaming past the glass at a pitch that would have terrified you months ago, and now registers instead as simply loud, familiar, a sound you've heard often enough that it no longer carries the same raw edge of dread it once did. You tend the lamp, check the ice on the glass, climb out onto the gallery when a thin crust begins forming, despite the season's supposed advance toward warmth, and you perform each task with a competence that feels standing there in the wind with your scraping tool in hand, almost effortless compared to that first terrified night out on this exact walkway months ago. You realize somewhere in the middle of that final real storm, simply a different keeper than the one who arrived on this rock in late autumn, hollowed out by months of hardship, certainly, but also built up, layer by layer, into someone who can meet a storm like this without the paralyzing fear that once accompanied every single gust. Dawn breaks over water considerably calmer than it's been in months. The storm's fury spent, apparently, in that single hard night, rather than settling in for the extended siege. Winter's worst weather always seemed to prefer. You extinguish the lamp and walk the tower for damage, with an ease that feels almost anticlimactic after everything this winter has already put you through, finding, this time, remarkably little to repair, a testament perhaps to a tower that's already weathered, the very worst this coast can offer and simply has less left to lose, to a storm of merely ordinary severity. Standing at the base of the tower afterward, looking out at water that's finally, genuinely calming, rather than simply pausing between assaults, you feel something loosen in your chest that's been held tight for longer than you can easily remember. A recognition that whatever remains of this posting, you've already survived its hardest tests, and everything ahead of you now is, comparatively, a gentler road toward its end. The supply boat that arrives roughly 2 weeks later brings news you've been waiting for, without quite letting yourself hope for it too openly. Word that your relief keeper is scheduled to arrive within the month, that your long posting on this rock is finally, genuinely approaching its close. You receive the news with a complicated tangle of feelings you don't fully untangle in the moment. Relief, certainly. An eagerness for warm rooms and ordinary company that you've been suppressing for months simply because dwelling on it too heavily would have made the remaining time harder to bear. But there's something else there too, something you don't expect and can't quite name at first, a reluctance, faint but genuine, at the idea of leaving this rock, this tower, this narrow, demanding, entirely self-contained life you've built here through sheer necessity over the course of one of the hardest winters you've ever lived through. You spend the final weeks of your posting in a strange, suspended state, still performing every duty with the same careful attention you've maintained since your very first night here, because the light still needs tending, regardless of how close your relief might be. But increasingly aware, in the back of your mind, that you're counting down now rather than simply enduring. And the counting changes the texture of even the most familiar tasks. You find yourself noticing details you'd stopped consciously registering months ago. The particular quality of light through the lamp room glass at dusk, the exact sound the mechanism makes when it's turning properly, the specific creak of the third stair from the top that you've navigated so many hundreds of times you could do it blind. You're saying goodbye, you realize, even before you've consciously decided to think of it that way, to a place that very nearly broke you, and that you're now, against every expectation you'd have had back in autumn, going to leave with something that feels remarkably close to genuine fondness. The relief keeper, when he finally arrives on a mild morning that feels almost unrecognizable compared to the brutal weather that greeted your own arrival months ago, is a younger man, clearly nervous in the particular way anyone would be nervous facing their first posting on a remote rock like this one, and you find yourself, in the hours before the boat that will carry you away is due to depart again, doing everything you can to hand over not just the tower's official duties, but everything you've actually learned, the things no manual or official training could have properly prepared either of you for. You walk him through the mechanism's ongoing quirks, showing him exactly which adjustments to make and how frequently to check for the hitch that still occasionally reappears despite your best repairs, information that exists nowhere in the official log except in the careful, detailed notes you made through the winter, precisely so that whoever came after you wouldn't have to rediscover the problem entirely from scratch. You show him the storerooms, the rationing calculations you've refined over months of hard experience, the particular signs that indicate a storm building versus a storm that's merely passing through. You tell him, as directly as you're able, about the isolation, about the way silence out here has its own weight and its own danger, and you watch him receive this information with the particular attentive seriousness of someone who suspects, correctly, that he's about to learn exactly how true it all is, regardless of how thoroughly he's warned in advance. There's a strange intimacy in this handover. Two strangers standing together in a place that demands more from a person than almost anywhere else either of you has likely ever lived. One of you carrying the accumulated knowledge of an entire hard winter and doing everything possible to pass that knowledge along before it's needed. The other standing at the very beginning of a journey you've just finished, about to discover, firsthand, everything you've spent the last several months learning the hard way. You find yourself, in these final hours, offering advice you didn't fully appreciate you possessed until the moment of articulating it, small, practical wisdom about rationing your reading material, about the specific discipline required to keep the mind steady through the longest stretches of silence, about trusting the tower's engineering, even when a storm makes trusting anything feel impossible. When the boat finally arrives to carry you away, cutting through water calm enough now that the crossing feels almost leisurely, compared to the tense, hurried departure of the boat that first brought you here, you find yourself pausing at the base of the tower for one final look upward before you climb aboard. The structure that once felt like an alien, hostile presence, a cold stone stranger you'd been abruptly assigned to inhabit, now looks, in this final moment, something closer to familiar, even in its own severe way, something you'd almost call beloved. You know every stare, every draft, every particular groan the structure makes under wind of every strength. You know this tower more intimately than you've known almost anywhere else you've ever lived, earned through months of the hardest, most demanding work of your life, and leaving it, even toward warmth and rest and human company you've been aching for since the depths of winter, carries a genuine weight you hadn't fully anticipated feeling. The boat pulls away from the rock, and you watch the tower shrink slowly against the horizon, the way you once watched the boat that dropped you off shrink into nothing months ago, in what feels now like an entirely different lifetime. The light atop that tower, though it's daytime now and the lamp sits dark and unlit, still seems to hold a kind of quiet authority even from this distance, a fixed point on a coast that spent an entire hard winter trying to prove that fixed points don't actually exist out here, that everything can be worn down, broken, overwhelmed, given enough time and enough force. The tower proved otherwise. And so, in your own quieter, more exhausted way, did you? You spend the crossing back to the mainland mostly in silence, watching the coastline slowly resolve into familiar shapes, harbors and rooftops, and the ordinary bustle of a world that continued on without you through every single one of the months you spent alone on that rock, tending a light that most of the people in that world will never think about, never wonder who kept it burning through the very worst nights of an especially hard winter. That anonymity, you understand now with a clarity you didn't fully possess when you first accepted this posting, is simply the nature of the work. And you find, somewhat to your own surprise, that you've made a kind of peace with it. The ships that passed safely by your rock through months of brutal weather will never know your name. The people sleeping soundly in coastal towns up and down this stretch of shore, trusting implicitly that the light will be there, steady and reliable, every single night, have no idea what that reliability actually costs the person maintaining it. You did the work anyway. You'll likely do it again on some future posting at some future tower, because the work matters regardless of whether anyone ever properly thanks you for it. And there's a particular hard-won satisfaction in having proven to yourself, if no one else, that you were equal to everything this posting demanded. The mainland receives you with all the ordinary comforts you spent months aching for. Warm rooms that don't require careful coal rationing, meals that don't need to be measured against an uncertain number of remaining days, unbroken stretches of sleep that don't demand you rouse yourself every few hours to climb freezing stairs. You find yourself, in these first weeks back among other people, oddly disoriented by the sheer abundance of it all, by conversations that happen simply because someone else is present to have them, by the strange luxury of not needing to constantly calculate whether your resources will stretch far enough to see you through to the next resupply. It takes longer than you'd have expected to fully settle back into a life that doesn't revolve entirely around a single flame that must never be allowed to go dark. But something in you has changed permanently. You realize, in ways that go beyond the simple physical toll the winter took, the chapped hands and the shoulder that still aches faintly in cold, damp weather, the leaner frame that months of careful rationing left you with. You carry now a particular kind of confidence that only comes from having actually tested yourself against something genuinely difficult and found, through months of hard, unglamorous, largely unwitnessed effort, that you were capable of meeting it. You think, sometimes, in quiet moments back on solid, stable ground, about that tower standing alone against the winter sea, about the younger keeper now occupying the post you left behind, learning firsthand everything you spent months learning the hard way, and about all the keepers who came before you both, stretching back through generations, each one adding their own quiet, unrecorded chapter to the tower's long history of simply, stubbornly, refusing to let the light go out. Because that, in the end, is the entire story of a lighthouse keeper's winter, distilled down past every individual storm and every particular hardship into something simpler and more durable than any single night's crisis. It is not a story of dramatic rescue or singular heroism, though there were nights, certainly, that asked something close to heroism of you. It is, more truly, a story of relentless, unglamorous persistence, of a duty performed faithfully night after night, regardless of exhaustion, regardless of fear, regardless of whether a single soul beyond the keeper himself ever fully appreciates what that duty actually costs. Ships passed safely. Sailors reached harbor who might not have, had that light gone dark on any one of the countless nights it was tested. And the man who kept it burning walked away from that rock, changed, hollowed out in some ways and strengthened in others, carrying forward into whatever ordinary life waits beyond the tower, a hard-won understanding of exactly what a person can endure, when enduring is the only option left, and when somewhere out in the dark, someone else is depending on the light staying lit. That's the story of the keepers who held these rocks through winters like this one, all along the world's most unforgiving coastlines, solitary guardians turning cold stone towers into the one steady, reliable thing standing between an entire ocean's fury and the ships that depend on finding their way safely past it. Their names, most of them, are lost now, unrecorded beyond a line or two in official logs no one much reads anymore. But the towers still stand along those same rocky shores, some still tended, some automated now, their duty performed by machines that don't feel cold or exhaustion or the particular weight of total isolation the way the keepers who came before them once did. But for a long stretch of history, it was hands like the ones in this story, chapped and aching and stubbornly capable, that kept those lights burning, night after night, storm after storm, asking nothing more in return than the quiet, private knowledge that the duty had been done, and done well, regardless of who was ever there to notice. So as you lie there now, warm and safe, with no storm outside demanding your vigilance, and no flame depending on your tired hands to keep it burning through the night, spare a thought for those solitary keepers out on their rocks, doing exactly that, through winter after winter, long before automation ever rendered their particular brand of stubborn endurance obsolete. Picture the tower standing dark and quiet against a calm night sky, its light finally, mercifully unneeded for once, and let that stillness carry you gently down into your own well-earned rest. Thanks so much for spending this time with me tonight here on Coldman Survival. If you enjoyed drifting off with this one, you know what helps more than almost anything: a like, a comment telling me where you tuned in from, and a subscribe if you'd like more nights like this one waiting for you. We'll be back soon with another story, another rock, another storm to weather together. Until then, close your eyes. Let the wind outside settle into nothing more than a gentle, distant hum, and sleep well. We'll meet again another night, another story, another gentle hour before dawn.